Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, everyone, to our North American colleagues. Good afternoon to our European colleagues, and good evening to those that are tuning in from Asia. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We are delighted to be able to put forward our Russia Military Capabilities Working Group. This is the first time we've had a public event since the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. We hope you are doing safe and well. A lot of things have certainly changed since, certainly here in the United States in mid-March, when the pandemic really struck. And we wish we were able to host this working group the way we always do at CSIS in our beautiful facilities. We get together with cups of coffee beforehand to meet colleagues and chat and catch up. Unfortunately, we can't do that right now, but we're hoping that the Zoom event really provides more reach and that we can gather more audiences together, although we can't do that in person. So that's one big change since the last time CSIS hosted this important working group. The second change is actually about leadership. Dr. Jeffrey Mankoff, who has been so instrumental in organizing a previous Russia Military Capabilities Working Group, unfortunately has left CSIS to be a distinguished research fellow at the National Defense University. We're so excited that Jeff will remain affiliated with CSIS and will remain active in this working group, but I'm delighted to be able to take a leadership role in this working group. And what better way, as many of you know, to start this working group than to talk about the Arctic and Russia's military posture and strategy. But here's the good news. One thing that hasn't changed is our partnership with the Center for Naval Analysis and our very own Mike Kofman, who is the director of the Russia Studies program at CNA. We're so grateful to continue to bring this conversation forward. And thank you, Mike, for agreeing to moderate. Normally I do that job when I'm at CSIS, but I'm going to be one of the speakers, and Mike has been very gracious to agree to be the moderator. So with that, again, we welcome you. We look forward to a great conversation about something that's growing increasingly important and getting a lot of attention in the headlines these days, Russia's military posture in the Arctic. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Heather, for the kind introduction, and to everyone for joining us today for what promises to be a great discussion on Russian military posture and intentions in the Arctic, a region that continues to garner attention. Russian forces
Mike, I think I'm just going to jump in here because I fear that Mike has not been able to connect with us. That's the other part of changing. We roll with the...
Apologize.
No, that's all right, Mike. Take it away.
Did I cut out the very beginning there? Terribly sorry. As I was saying, just thank everyone again for joining us for what promises a great discussion on Russian military posture and tension in the Arctic, a region that obviously garners attention, especially after a tremendous amount of Russian investment in modernization, restoring operational capability, and building bases, runways, radars, and the like, and not to mention increased operations exercised by both Russia and NATO forces. So the questions we'll try to look at today are: how should we interpret Russian military modernization and changing posture in the Arctic? What are we seeing, and what should concern us the most in terms of Russian capabilities, exercises, or operations? Beyond Russia, what are the important linkages or interactions with other powers we may be overlooking, such as China, and how should policymakers respond to these developments? So joining us today to help answer these short and incredibly easy questions are two colleagues whose names I think are at times synonymous with Arctic research, Heather Conley and Katarzyna Zysk. Heather Conley, Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and Arctic, and Director of the Europe Program at CSIS. Previously, she served in senior positions in government, including the Bureau of European Eurasian Affairs, among others. She's frequently featured as a foreign policy analyst and Europe expert in prominent media outlets. Katarzyna Zysk serves as Deputy Director at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies and as head of their Center for Security Policy. She's held numerous fellowships, scholarships, and is a professor of international relations. Her work and commentary appears widely in media and prominent publications. I think today we'll start with Heather Conley, who has recently published a report looking at great power competition in the Arctic. Heather, can you give us a sense of what we're seeing and what does that mean?
Mike, thank you so much. And Katarzyna and I have sort of divided and conquered a little bit here the Arctic. I'm going to focus on the terrestrial component of Russia's military posture, and then we're going to hand the baton over, and Katarzyna is going to talk about the maritime component. So let's start with a map. Boy, you can't start with the Arctic unless you've got a good map. So what you're seeing here is a map that CSIS produced as part of the report that Mike mentioned, America's Arctic Moment, Great Power Competition in the Arctic to 2050. We plotted out Russia's military posture in the Arctic. As I said, this map doesn't do justice to the distance and the extraordinary time, but we wanted to compress it a little bit to show you those developments. As we stay on this map, just two reflections to keep in mind as we continue with this whole conversation. The Arctic is incredibly important to Russia's economic future, and that's the energy, mineral resources, and the shipping route, the Northern Sea route, which traverses the Russian Arctic. And it is absolutely vital to Russia's military posture. So it is so important in both fronts, and this is why Russia has made pretty significant investments in the Arctic. So what I'm going to describe to you is what actually Russian senior military officials describe as Russia's protective dome over the Arctic. And what I want you to think about is really putting the Russian Arctic into two halves. The east, so we call this, it's two Arctics. The eastern part of the Arctic, so sort of the central point in the middle to sort of Koltenny to the east, to Wrangel Island, and then the western Arctic. So I'm going to start in the very far east. I want to go to Wrangel Island, and this is a commercial satellite imagery. Again, all of this is in our report with a lot of in-depth analysis that I'm going to gloss over very quickly because it's just too much information. But Wrangel Island is approximately 300 nautical miles from Alaska. What you're looking at is the Sopka-2 radar, a very sophisticated radar. This, again, Wrangel Island is really where the beginning of the Northern Sea route, as vessels would come up the Bering Strait and go to traverse the Northern Sea route. This is really a perfect example of Russia's protective dome. It's enhanced air and maritime domain awareness, meteorological information, because Russia has such an ambitious vision for the Northern Sea route and is welcoming commercial activity. At the same time, it has to understand what that activity is. So this is, again, is a reestablished radar and facility and base in the far east of Russia, but it's, again, of course, closest to the United States. So as we start moving from the east to the center of the Russian Arctic, then things begin to change. And as we watched, again, we don't have a satellite imagery of this, but I just want to mention it to you very briefly. Koltenny Island, which is the largest island in the New Siberian lands, this is where we start to see a little bit more significant Russian military footprint. You have, of course, and we'll show a picture of this in the next slide, the trefoil or the Russian cloverleaf, which is an installation that's very designed. This is the Alexanderland, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But if you see that funny clover leaf in the middle, that's quite known for very Russian housing of their officers and their officials. Red, white, and blue, very prominent. They certainly taken journalists to see that type of facility. But what we begin to see as we march towards the center and then onto the west portion of the Arctic and the Kola Peninsula, what we will start to see is increasingly sophisticated coastal defense systems. Roxana, we'll just go one back. Thanks so much. Coastal defense systems, missile launcher vehicles. You start to see now air bases, lengthening of runways. This is now obviously designed for protective dome, but it's now increasingly becoming a much more significant A2AD prospect. It is to make sure that there is denial capabilities as we move forward. And then here, the picture that you see right now, Alexanderland, this is the largest on Franz Josef Land in the archipelago. This is Russia's most northerly military outpost. And what makes Alexanderland so significant is the Nagorskaya Air Base. What we're seeing there is now with the increase in runway, fighter aircraft, strategic bombers, this is really, as Wrangel was sort of to the outpost to the east, Alexanderland is really that most critical protective for the west as the beginning of the Northern Sea route moving west, but it's also now providing protection to the Kola Peninsula. And as we move west, what we start to see, and Alexanderland is a perfect example, the introduction of S-400s, radars, SIGINT, electronic warfare. These are the capabilities that start to grow in the sophistication of the equipment. But of course, this is all about the Kola Peninsula. And then go ahead, Roxana, we'll move to that slide. The Kola Peninsula is truly the main event. And Katarzyna is going to talk about the critical nature of the Northern Fleet and the strategic submarine nuclear deterrent. But Kola Peninsula increasingly is seen as significant conventional buildup. We're again seeing, obviously, this is their land-based nuclear deterrent with ICBMs, but we are really seeing a much more significant preparation that could, I think, provide much more significant offensive capability. So again, there is a real progression from the east, which is again is monitoring, protective, as you move towards the center and then get towards the west. It gets more significant and certainly, I think, much more capable of offensive capabilities. I usually call this the 60-40 rule. 60% of what Russia is doing in the military, in the Arctic, is certainly for protective dome, territorial protection capabilities, and monitoring increased activity. 40%, and maybe Katarzyna can argue with me or not, is now becoming much more designed for offensive capabilities, focusing on the North Atlantic sea lanes of communication, and a bit more of a challenge to certainly NATO and US security. So with that, thank you for those maps, Roxana, and then we'll turn it over to Katarzyna.
Thank you, Heather.
Okay, can I just start? Thank you very much for this invitation to exchange ideas and at last engage with the public. It's been a while. I thought that I would start with some three main general observations and arguments regarding the Russian military buildup in the Arctic and the maritime component in particular. And I think the first important thing to underline is that despite over-ambitious timeframes, Russia has successfully modernized its strategic submarine fleet. The largest share is still deployed in the European western part of the Arctic. And this includes, of course, the fourth generation Boris-class submarines, which are to become the backbone of the Russian sea-based nuclear deterrence. The 6 older Delta IV are modernized in addition to various supporting assets and also refurbished a new infrastructure. And I think the top priority given to these assets highlights the continued critical importance of nuclear deterrence and second strike capability in Russian military doctrine and strategy, as well as the central role of the Arctic or the Arctic plays in supporting these missions. So protecting the strategic submarines and their operational area is still the top task of the Northern Fleet. The bastion defense concept, which was developed during the Cold War, still remains in place, although there are some important modifications. So the bastion aims to ensure survival and freedom of action for the strategic submarines through several layers of defenses, involving a combined use of naval, land, air, and space-based capabilities. In some conflict scenarios, Russia would likely aim to take control over parts of the Barents Sea and the Norwegian Sea, which are the closest to the naval bases, while aiming to deny control for the adversary farther south to the Gulf Gap, where Russia would be unlikely to establish control. However, and this is my second point already mentioned by Heather, the Arctic is not only about the Kola Peninsula and strategic submarines. Although nuclear weapons remain or have still the top priority, the role of non-nuclear weapons in Russian defense and deterrence in the Arctic has been increasing significantly, especially after 2010, providing Russia an ability to fulfill a wider range of missions. And long-range precision weapons, including Iskander, the land-based ballistic and cruise missiles, Calibre sea-based cruise missile, but also hypersonic cruise missiles that are coming, that Russia is developing and planning to deploy in the Arctic, the Zircon and Kinzhal. They play a particularly important role in non-nuclear deterrence. They add flexibility and offer a broader range of options to the layered defense system that Russia has built in the region. And notably, these weapons are important also because the availability of large ocean-going surface ships in the Russian Navy is still very limited. So the Russian shipbuilding industry has struggled for years to live up to Putin's ambition to rebuild Russia's blue water navy. Russia has managed to add new capabilities, such as the new frigates of the Admiral Gorshkov class, even grand landing ships, or even military diesel-electric icebreakers of the Ilya Muromets class. But still, their production is limited. It's very slow compared to ambitions. For instance, the ambition to build a new destroyer, and not to mention aircraft carriers, discussed since the early 2000s, has been postponed indefinitely. So in order to maintain some ability of the Northern Fleet to long-range naval operations, Russia is modernizing several large old Soviet warships, such as the Kirov-class cruiser, Admiral Nakhimov. But the process is very slow. It's marked by delays. There have been several severe accidents, including sinking in 2018 of the large floating dock, which is used to upgrade these ships. So Russia's pragmatic solution in this situation has been namely to focus on armament rather than on platforms. That means build smaller corvettes and frigates, which are faster and cheaper to build, and arm them with long-range precision weapons to increase their range, their impact, reduce the need to approach targets. So there are a number of limitations in the Russian Navy. Russia is trying to manage it, and relatively successfully. But despite also all this limitation, and this is my third point, the complexity of operations and exercises by the Northern Fleet, their geographical scope, quantity has expanded significantly over the past 12 years. Russia has devoted a special attention to increasing interoperability with other fleets and other defense branches, on shortening the reaction time, thus mitigating Russia's vulnerability to surprise attack, and on enhancing strategic mobility. Russia has also added new elements to the operational pattern, making it less predictable, as we saw during the massive naval exercise last year, Ocean Shield. I can talk about it later if you like. So the exercise pattern also shows that the Northern Fleet should not be regarded as a force limited to the Arctic only. It may be used in support of Russian military operation with an epicenter or in a conflict, supporting Russian ongoing conflict with an epicenter in a different region, for instance, the Baltic or the Black Sea. And this concerns in particular regional war scenarios where another great power or alliance will be involved. So in other words, the Russian military force in the Arctic is not necessarily going to stay in the Arctic. This is also because Russia's overall military capability remains limited despite the largely successful military modernization since 2008. And for instance, the deployment of the Arctic Brigade, the 200th Motor Rifle Brigade from Pechenga in Donbass in Ukraine in 2014 is another illustration of that. And lastly, this is also why in the future we may see more activity, naval activity along the Northern Sea Route, which is along the Siberian coast, because it may facilitate Russia to move the capital ships, submarines, and surface vessels from the Atlantic to the Pacific and the other way around between these two important naval bases. Thank you.
Thanks, Katarzyna. Great opening presentations from both speakers. I'd now like to sort of take moderator's privilege and perhaps ask each of you a question, and also remind our wonderful audience that those of you who are interested in asking questions, part of the Q&A portion, please again go to the CSIS event webpage for this and click on that link that says Ask Live Questions and submit them. And I'll receive them and try to put them together for our speakers. So Heather, listening to these two great presentations, I'm thinking, at least taking first a Washington, D.C. perspective, how should we think about potential responses to these issues? Do we need some kind of forum to discuss hard security issues with Russia? Is there room for engagement? Is there a need for greater presence and activity by NATO? Kind of what does this mean to us? In part, why do we care? And just to Katarzyna, of course, it's not only about the Arctic, right? And we need to think about as well, kind of what are the linkages and security implications for other regions, other waterways of relevance or seas, etc. And we know that Arctic countries care, right? They live up there, they deal with this activity every day. So we can understand, it's almost self-explanatory why this is of interest to Norway, why Norway cares, right? But if you can think about what else we should look at in terms of linkage, in terms of other issues, whether it's relationship with other powers, whether it's other security concerns, that'd be great. So I'd like to turn to Heather first and get your thoughts on that question, and then we'll follow with Katarzyna.
Mike, thank you. Two big questions. Let me start with the forum. So I think it's absolutely critical to find a forum where we can discuss hard military security. And right now we have been looking for a forum, a venue, a mechanism, and we can't find one. The Arctic Council, the Intergovernmental Forum, is forbidden to address hard security. The NATO-Russia Council does not seem like an appropriate venue, in part because many NATO countries don't want to increase tensions or concern about militarization or potential conflict in the Arctic. Various U.S. Government colleagues have tried to create security roundtables by the U.S. European Command. They have tried to create an Arctic Chief of Defense conversation. We just can't seem to get it right. I would argue that we need to bring together the Arctic 8 defense ministers in a forum to talk about these issues, because exactly as Katarzyna said, what concerns me the most is the exercise tempo has gone through the roof in the Arctic. Some of these, as we saw in March of 2015, are SNAP exercises, not notified. Some are notified and given some notice. But we're seeing an increase in uptick in accidents just last year with the tragic sinking of a Russian submarine for unknown reasons of what it was testing. There's a lack of transparency. There's a lack of confidence building measures. We don't, as this conversation will unpack, we don't completely understand Russia's interest and intentions. We don't want to misunderstand them. And now that the arms control architecture is being dramatically reduced, I think this reaffirms the need for a forum. And we need to get one very quickly. I think the Russian side would be interested in this. I think there should be a lot of interest in the US and NATO allies to create some sort of a forum. The other question is probably going to take an hour to chat about, so I'm not going to do that, although you know how passionate I feel about US policy towards the Arctic. The United States is going to have to make a determination of the importance of the Arctic to U.S. defense. And as we try to articulate in the report that we mentioned, we sort of turn the research question around, because quite frankly, we've utterly failed in trying to make sure people understood the strategic imperative that is the Arctic. What we suggested is, well, Russia and China, for different reasons, view this region as strategically critical. So what happens if the US doesn't? What will the future look like? What will 2050 look like? And we conclude that if the US does not increase its physical presence in the Arctic, now we're not talking about rebuilding massively, but in making sure that we have vessels that can traverse the Arctic, that we ensure continued US access, unfettered access, freedom of navigation, that we can, for search and rescue and oil spill response, to more hard security. We have to make that investment to protect the avenues of approach to the United States, whether that's in the North Atlantic or the North Pacific. And that is going to require an investment. What the United States has been expert at doing is trying to avoid that investment. It writes studies to avoid the investment. It talks about Russia taking these actions, but that time has now come to the end. I think the very surprising White House National Security Memorandum on icebreakers that came out, very specifically talking about this need, suggests that there is an urgency. We're already very far behind, but this isn't about keeping up with the Russians. That's not appropriate. It's just about making sure that we enhance NATO and US defense as we see Russia's much more forceful conventional and nuclear presence. And we haven't even talked about China, but that'll be a separate conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Heather.
So may I just start with the second question, if it's okay? I think there are many good reasons for why the Arctic should be on the agenda of the US and NATO. There are many reasons. One, of course, which is probably not exactly well understood, is that, well, this is different. This is a new fifth ocean opening, and when it's open, it will be used. And while Russia is establishing its, stronger military presence in basically all defense branches, getting much closer to achieving its objective of being the leading Arctic power, as they say, or actually dominating Arctic dominating nation in the region, it will be harder to contest the Russian presence in this region. As Russia is establishing and pushing farther and farther what is the new normal with the military exercises in the naval airspace domain, the electromagnetic spectrum, etc. So I think marking the presence and, as Heather said, also, the principle of freedom of navigation in this region is extremely important. The Chinese-Russian relationship, we can also discuss, this is absolutely something that is going already now. The military link is not exactly very clear. However, there are a number of dual use capabilities that China is developing, and it can be used in the Arctic in the future. And although Russia is, it's a highly sensitive question of potential Chinese military presence in the Arctic in the future, but I would not completely take it out of the table. It will depend on the geopolitical constellation, relationship between Russia, the United States and NATO, and also the position of Russia in the international system. So I've mentioned already that the Arctic is not only about the Arctic, it's also the fact that Russia has been using these assets to support, at least supporting operations in other regions. So if something serious were to happen in the Black Sea or in the Baltic Sea, it's very likely that Russia will also activate or deploy the bastion defense and, of course, to protect the assets in the Arctic. But it can also be used in support of horizontal and vertical escalation to pressure the enemy from the other geographical location. I think in general, it should be also understood that, we often talk about the Russian military buildup in the Arctic as a sort of one monolithic space. And the thing is, I think that may be partly a reason why people do not really understand well how urgent the development in the region is, because what Russia has, the Russian Arctic is made of different subregions, and some of them are more troubled than others, like especially the European or Western part of the Arctic, centered around the Northern Fleet. That's where Russia has the most of the military capabilities, most of the exercises, the military offensive and defensive capabilities. What happens in the rest of the Arctic, so the central and eastern part of the Arctic, is it's also important, but this is directed toward more farther medium to long-term future. Again, what's happening in the Western Arctic is now, and also seen from the Russian perspective, from the perspective of Russian threat perception. So I think there are differences. If you point at the important development, Russia strengthening the early warning, building the radar stations, refurbishing the new naval bases or building new naval bases in the Central and Eastern Arctic, that's important. But what is happening in the West? I think it's a question of immediate. It should be a question of immediate concern to the allies.
Thank you, Katarzyna. I'd now like to try to group up a couple of the questions we've gotten. It's a pretty active audience to our two wonderful speakers here, and I'll sort of kind of read out the first three that I think is worth for us engaging with. One is a comment here that Russia will assume chairmanship of the Arctic Council and the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, and sort of what are our concerns and expectations of that chairmanship? Another question asks, what measures have Nordic states taken to secure their Arctic areas against Russian encroachment? And the third one that's, I think, worth for all of us to engage with, even though none of us are climate change scientists, there are several questions that say, look, recently the Arctic's experienced significant climate change, right? There have been days with over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Has this dramatic swing in temperatures affected Russian position in the region? How is Russia responding to climate change in the Arctic? And so perhaps the best way to break these up, maybe Heather, if you could offer some thoughts on what are your expectations of sort of Russian, or thoughts on Russian chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Katarzyna, what do you think about the responses of Nordic states? I think you're well positioned for that conversation. And then any thoughts either of you have on climate change and the implications of that for our conversation?
Well, Mike, thank you so much. So yes, we have 11 more months of the Icelandic chairmanship of the Arctic Council until next May. Russia takes over. It's a 2-year rotating chairmanship. What I've been told is that Russia plans to have much more of a continuity agenda to the Iceland agenda. Again, these agendas are set fairly long. The Arctic Council only can focus on environmental protection and sustainable development. But you are right, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, which was something that very much designed and brought forward by the US and Russia at a very difficult moment, because of course the FSB is the entity that joins the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, and of course the FSB is a great challenge to US security, and lots of waivers had to occur for even that conversation to initially begin. But I really don't believe that it's sort of like having a split screen. What the Arctic Council will do and Russia's management of it will have no impact on all these issues that we're discussing. And that's the problem. We don't have a place where we can have these conversations. If anything, I would imagine the Russian chairmanship will use the chairmanship as a platform, and to have the other 7 Arctic Council countries be very supportive of Russia's Arctic policies and ambitions. So I don't see that. And the Coast Guard Forum, again, focuses on the International Oil Spill Response and Prevention Agreement, as well as the International Search and Rescue Agreement. But as we've seen, and this is my segue to the climate change, with this devastating diesel oil spill in Norilsk, which evidently was a clear surprise to President Putin and Russian leadership. We have no idea how devastating that will be to the environment in the Russian Arctic Delta, if you will, and their entire river supply. We can only imagine it's completely devastating. And you're absolutely right. While Russia has been so focused, understandably, on the great economic opportunities that an opening Arctic represents, what I think none of us, and particularly the Russian government, has come to grips with is the colossal calamity that is the environmental change that Russia is experiencing. And this is clearly permafrost thaw, which is what contributed to this massive diesel oil spill, because a tank evidently broke apart because permafrost thaw. We're seeing that even in defense applications, runways that are sinking, into naval infrastructure, port infrastructure sinking because of coastal erosion. But you're absolutely right. The temperature spike that we've seen, we are going to have a wildfire season unlike we have not seen. We have anthrax occurring in the Russian Arctic, ocean acidification. I mean, I don't mean to be in a doom cycle here, but this is extraordinary climate experience. And what concerns me is the Russians and the lack of transparency on what is happening in the Russian Arctic, which impacts all Arctic coastal states. It impacts globally this inherent desire for secrecy, delay. In fact, we had our Nordic colleagues, Sweden and Norway, detecting radiation isotopes, and we can't figure out what from Western Russia, but we don't know where that's coming from. This is the type of issue that, again, requires close cooperation, transparency, confidence building measures, joint cooperation. If the Russian chairmanship of the Arctic Council can start addressing that and that transparency, fantastic. But right now, many international scientists can't even travel to Russia to understand the profound climate impacts. That's what we have to start opening and using, hopefully, this chairmanship as an opportunity to help Russia manage a climate catastrophe that's unfolding before our very eyes.
Great comments, Heather. Katarzyna?
So the Nordic countries, well, of course, what's happening over the border in the Arctic has been of a concern. I mean, a lot of the capabilities that Russia is investing in have a clearly defensive character, but of course, there is a number of offensive capabilities, and some of the military exercises have been also quite provocative, including simply several times simulations of attacks on different sites, especially in Norway, including the Norwegian intelligence installations, radar station, attacks, simulating attacks on sites where important meetings were taking place. So obviously this has been a concern. There is an uncertainty about the intentions behind these kind of activities, and combined with, of course, significantly increased capability. So, the sort of natural reflex has been to think about, how these countries should refocus on territorial defenses. I mean, especially, this has been a discussion in NATO on territorial defense. Article 5, in case of Arctic countries, Norway is probably the most affected among the Arctic countries because, of course, of the common border. The exercises are affecting Norway directly, including, exercises in the electromagnetic spectrum, the GPS jamming, and the like. So the focus has been on increasing military presence, increasing military activity, showing the flag. However, it's important to do it in a predictable and measured way, so it does not spark the security dilemma dynamics, does not feed into the Russian narrative and into the Russian threat perception. So we've seen more activities more activity by NATO. Trajan Juncture is one prominent example. But again, this balancing act between increasing military presence and activity and also maintaining dialogue and not fanning the flames has been a very important theme, especially here in Norway. And we should also remember that although there is a lot of focus on military activity by NATO and NATO allies, the recent exercise by the US and Great Britain, it is incomparable with what has been going on just across the border. And also the manner in which it has been going on. I mentioned the provocative exercises, but also the unannounced military exercises that we've seen also across the border. As for the climate change, I think I find it a fascinating issue. Russia came with a climate change doctrine before the top meeting the climate summit in Copenhagen in 2009. That was the first climate doctrine, which was actually, it was quite balanced. So Russia has acknowledged then that there is a number of positive implications of climate change, but also a number of huge problems. The wildfires, Heather has mentioned, the terrible problem with permafrost, whole cities, sinking, and of course the existentially important to Russia infrastructure, energy infrastructure, which is built on permafrost. So there is, as also Heather mentioned, there is this optimism about the opening Arctic, what we can do about it, the access to this enormous energy resources, mineral resources that can strengthen Russian state budget. There is certainly a great optimism about what Russia can do with the Arctic and with the Arctic resources. It has not been going that very well thus far, but there is still a lot of focus on that. But there is a great concern about how the natural environment may affect the Russian economic activity, but also how the opening Arctic may be invaded by foreign stakeholders, which has been partly driving the Russian interest into strengthening its military position, its economic position, its also legal position in the Arctic.
Thanks, Katarzyna. Wonderful answers. So we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to try to group up as many of the last remaining questions as I can, and there are quite a few. I'll tell you that much, and some very good responses to some of the comments by our speakers. And we'll take the last one as I think more of a military-oriented set of questions, where we'll both look at what's happening with the Russian military and Navy, and also at the same time, what are the potential responses to the United States and how we should structure those. So we have a number of questions, basically looking at, so what are the Russian naval ambitions, and what is the future modernization of the Northern Fleet? Has it reached its upper level in terms of modernization potential? Will it be more of a sea-down mosquito fleet, or is it going to have more blue water platforms? And of course, also kind of following up on our conversation, when we talk about parts of Russian military modernization in the Arctic being maybe 40% offensive, well, how do we sort of envision that offense being used? Why is Russia investing in that kind of capability? Now, we also have a similar, I think, a good complementary set of questions of saying, okay, well, what should the United States response to this be? What kind of Arctic presence do we need? Should we prioritize offensive capabilities rather than defensive ones? How should we think about our own exercise in the region and Russian potential responses to them? Should we worry about that? The security dilemma that Katarzyna mentioned. And some questions that's playing devil's advocate, basically saying, well, look, why can't, for the United States, we just use SSNs, nuclear-powered submarines and fighter aircraft and the like to provide the presence, the kind that we need in the Arctic? Why do we need ships? Why do we need exercises like the kind that Sixth Fleet recently did up in the Barents, right? So with that, maybe, Katarzyna, perhaps if you could start first, briefly give us a sense, especially tied to your presentation, what is kind of the future of the Russian Northern Fleet modernization, how we should think about those offensive capabilities, and then Heather, maybe take off on how we should think about the U.S. response.
Excellent. So yeah, I mean, definitely, as we've heard since early 2000s, and maybe especially after 2007, there is an ambition to rebuild Russian blue water navy. So acquire large combatant surface vessels. And Russia has been trying to push that development for a number of years, but as I mentioned in my presentation, this has not been going very well for a number of problems that are affecting the Russian shipbuilding program. There are structural challenges in the Russian shipbuilding industry. The sanctions has affected some of the problems, some of the programs, including the frigate Grigorovich class and the Gorshkov class, because the cooperation with Ukraine and Germany has been put on hold, with other countries as well. And so again, the ambition is there. There are even models of the leader, the destroyer, of two new aircraft carriers models are ready, but these programs have been postponed indefinitely because of the economic situation, because of the problems of the day. And so again, the focus is still, the priority of the Russian Navy has been to, I mean, at least in the Arctic, has been to focus on the nuclear deterrence, maintaining second strike capability, but also expanding the area of surface operation with what Russia has. So partly what we've seen in the past, over 10 years is, because Russia has so few and aging large surface vessels, Russia has been exercising, moving them between these two, between the different theaters of naval operations. Again, the Ocean Shield, this massive exercise, has been another example of that. The Baltic Fleet, the Black Sea Fleet, the Northern Fleet participated in this exercise, among others, exercising denying NATO access to the Baltic Sea. So, but again, Russia has been also showed the ability to be pragmatic. And as I mentioned, okay, we don't have big ships. How we can solve part of the problem, with the range, with the firepower, and the long-range precision weapons come into that. They will not solve all the problems. Of course, the prestige, which is very important, when it comes to blue water navy. It's been the prestige of having that, being, blue water navy being a symbol of a great power, has been a very important driving force. But again, some of the missions will be solved by creativity and using what Russia's strongest sides they have, like the missile technology, to enhance the capability of the Russian Navy. And I would just mention in the end that also, when it comes to the pragmatism, creativity, Russia has been also experimenting with a number of new weapons, enhancing some of the conventional and nuclear missions of the Russian Navy. The project of the Poseidon, the unmanned weapon systems, the drone, nuclear powered and nuclear capable, that is in the pipeline, is one example. Another example are unmanned robotic mines that Russia has been experimenting with. So I think this is also a part of development that we should look at. So it's not only about, this traditional, blue water versus green and brown navy, but also how Russia may combine these different capabilities to reach its objectives and to fulfill the missions they have. Thank you.
Thanks, Katarzyna.
Thanks. Mike, I think just in concluding remarks, just to pull a thread from Katarzyna, and then I'll talk about U.S. posture. For me, it is both the new weapons that Russia is developing. Now, these are not designed per se for the Arctic, but they are housed in the Arctic, which makes the Arctic a challenge for us. And then I would also we didn't get a chance to talk about Ocean Shield, but the exercising that Russia is doing, the combined operations with their new weapon capabilities, tells me that they are signaling not only capability and interaction, but potentially intent. And I think that's what we have to keep our eye on. And the urgency that Katarzyna talked about these issues is what is completely lacking in the US discourse. There is no urgency. We're admiring in some ways this new exciting area, but we're not understanding the urgency of it. So what does the US do about it? So my acronym, because if we don't have an acronym, I know we're not alive, it's sort of a twist. I call it AAD. We need awareness, maritime and air awareness. This is satellite issues. Katarzyna talked about the jamming, the electronic warfare issues. We need greater eyes and ears, whether that's through unmanned vehicles, awareness. We have to know what's going on, vast stretches. The second is access. We have to retain access to all parts of the Arctic. So that requires icebreakers. That requires, to my Navy friends, ice-strengthened surface fleet. We have to be able to reach ice-covered areas. And we also, that access is also about exercises. And I think former Navy Secretary Richard Spencer had it right. We have to practice to learn what we don't know, to get banged around, to go, we do not have the capabilities nor the experienced operators to work in this environment. So we have awareness, A, access, A, and then D. I do think this is largely a defensive posture. This is not offensive. This is defending the two avenues of approach to the United States through the North Atlantic and the North Pacific, and to understand that we have to have as well a sophisticated combined operations of air, land, and sea to be able to enhance that defense. And of course, the defense of the North Atlantic is so vital for NATO's security and protecting those sea lanes. So we have a lot of work to do in both understanding what Russia is doing militarily and then understanding how we better prepare ourselves for a future that we know from a climate impact is going to be extraordinary, and a very focused and a prioritized Russian government that thinks very strategically and critically about the Arctic. So, Mike, I don't know about you, but I think if we got that many questions and we need to sign off to let others get on with their day, we may have to return to this conversation again. And I said we didn't even talk about in greater depth Chinese and Russian military interactions, some of the things we saw in Vostok 2018, some of their naval activities, whether that's in the Far East, Baltic Sea. We have a lot more to discuss, but thank you, Mike, for your expert moderating skills, juggling a lot of complexity and a lot of great audience questions. Katarzyna, thank you so much. What I know about the Arctic is what I've learned from you and my colleagues at the Institute for Defense Studies in Norway, and the amazing work and scholarship that you have been producing. And please, I know Katarzyna is working on a new report. Please check out, if you have some time, America's Arctic Moment, Great Power Competition in the Arctic to 2050. And if there's anything more we can do, we look forward to hosting a future Russia military capabilities working group with our colleagues at CNA. Stay tuned for additional announcements and programming. And with that, thank you, be safe and well, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks so much, everybody.